Montana Territory, 1868. The wind carried the scent of pine and promise across the newly established settlement of Whispering Pines. The town had sprung up like a determined wildflower in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, where civilization met wilderness in an uneasy truce. Austin Prescott adjusted his collar as he dismounted from his chestnut mare. At 25, he was lean and hard-muscled from years spent in the mountains, trapping and trading with the few remaining native tribes who hadn't yet been forced onto reservations. His clean-shaven face and clear blue eyes belied the hardness he'd cultivated in himself, a necessary armor against the wilderness that had claimed so many others. His light brown hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, giving him a boyish appearance that contradicted the weathered look in his eyes. Austin had come down from the mountains just twice in the past 3 years. The settlements made him uneasy. Too many people, too many expectations, too many chances to get attached to something or someone that the frontier would inevitably take away. He'd learned that lesson the hard way when a Blackfoot raid had claimed his parents' homestead when he was just 17. Since then, he'd lived by one rule. The only companionship a mountain man needed was his rifle, his knife, and occasionally his horse. "This is just a supply run," he muttered to himself as he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store. "Flour, coffee, ammunition, maybe some whiskey. Then back where I belong." The mercantile's bell jangled as Austin stepped inside. The familiar smells of leather, tobacco, and dried goods greeted him, along with the curious stares of the townsfolk. New settlements always brought the same mixture: hardy pioneers, desperate families, opportunistic merchants, and women looking for a new start. Austin avoided their gazes. Getting to know people only made it harder when they died or left, and out here, everyone eventually did one or the other. "Well, look what the wind blew in," called Jonas Weber, the storekeeper. "If it ain't the mountain ghost himself. Thought you might have been taken by a grizzly by now." Austin nodded curtly. "Just need supplies, Jonas. Planning to be back up before sunset. Always in a hurry to get back to that wilderness." Jonas shook his head. "Town's growing. Might be worth staying around for more than just supplies one of these days." Austin was about to reply when the bell jangled again. He glanced toward the door and froze. She was slender but strong-looking, with golden blonde hair cascading in waves past her shoulders. Her simple blue calico dress couldn't hide the grace with which she moved. At 22, she carried herself with a confidence that seemed out of place in this rough settlement. When her green eyes met Austin's, something flickered in them. Recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. "Afternoon, Miss Beatrice," Jonas called cheerfully. "Your order came in yesterday. Got those fabric bolts and sewing notions you were waiting on." "Thank you, Mr. Weber," she replied, her voice melodic but with a slight tremor as her eyes remained fixed on Austin. Austin looked away quickly, unsettled by her gaze. She seemed familiar somehow, but he couldn't place her. Mountain solitude had made him forget how to interact with people, especially beautiful women. As Jonas gathered Austin's supplies, Beatrice approached the counter. She stood close enough that Austin caught the faint scent of lavender. His pulse quickened, and he silently cursed his body's betrayal. "It's been a long time," she said softly, her words clearly meant for him. Austin glanced at her, confused. "Ma'am, you don't remember," she said, a statement rather than a question. A small, sad smile played at her lips. Before Austin could respond, the door burst open again, and a man in a dusty black suit strode in. "Miss Zimmerman, there you are," the man exclaimed. "I've been looking all over. The Reverend needs to discuss the final arrangements for the ceremony tomorrow." "Of course, Mr. Holden," she nodded. "I'll be right along." The man tipped his hat to Austin and Jonas before departing. Austin found himself oddly relieved at the interruption. "Ceremony?" Austin asked Jonas, trying to sound casual as he paid for his supplies. "Miss Zimmerman's getting married tomorrow," Jonas replied. "To that banker fellow from Helena. Quite the catch, they say." Austin felt an inexplicable hollowness in his chest. "Congratulations, ma'am," he said stiffly. "Thank you," she replied, her eyes never leaving his face. "Though I find it curious to accept congratulations from a stranger who once knew me so well." With those enigmatic words hanging in the air, she collected her package and walked out, leaving Austin staring after her, his carefully constructed isolation suddenly feeling less like protection and more like a prison. Austin couldn't sleep that night. He'd made camp on the outskirts of town, intending to head back into the mountains at first light, but the woman's words kept echoing in his mind. A stranger who once knew me so well. Try as he might, he couldn't place her face, though something about her eyes nagged at the edges of his memory. The next morning, instead of riding out, Austin found himself walking through town. He told himself he was just checking if the gunsmith had received any new Sharps rifles, but his feet carried him toward the small white church on the hill. A crowd had gathered, dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Wednesday. The wedding. Austin hung back, watching from a distance as guests filtered into the church. He shouldn't care. He had his mountains, his solitude, his safety from the pain that came with human connections. Yet something about Beatrice Zimmerman had reached through his carefully constructed walls and tugged at something he thought he'd buried years ago. As the last guests entered the church, Austin turned to leave. He had no business here. But a soft voice stopped him. "I knew you'd come." He turned to find Beatrice standing behind him, not in a wedding dress, but in a simple riding outfit, her blonde hair braided down her back. "Aren't you supposed to be inside?" Austin asked, confused. "I'm supposed to be a lot of places," she replied, a hint of defiance in her voice. "But I've spent too long doing what I'm supposed to do." Austin studied her face, frustration mounting. "You said I knew you once." "You did," she confirmed. "Deer Lodge, 1863. Your father traded with mine. You taught me how to fish in the creek behind our properties." She paused, searching his face. "You promised to come back for me when you turned 18. But you never did." The memory hit Austin like a physical blow. A summer of sunshine and laughter. A girl with golden braids and a gap-toothed smile. His first kiss, behind her father's barn. And then the raid that took everything. That sent him fleeing into the mountains, too consumed by grief to remember promises made to a 14-year-old girl. "Beatrice Zimmerman," he breathed. "Little B." Her smile was bittersweet. "Not so little anymore. Your father's farm, sold after he died 2 years ago. Pneumonia." She looked toward the church. "I came west with my cousin's family. Met Mr. Holden at a social. He offered security, a good home. And love." Austin asked before he could stop himself. Beatrice's eyes darkened. "Some of us can't afford to wait for love twice." The accusation in her words stung, but Austin couldn't deny their truth. He had abandoned her, forgotten her in his determination to need no one. "I should let you go," he said, stepping back. "Your groom will be waiting." "Yes," she said, not moving. "Though it seems I've developed a habit of waiting for men who don't come." With that, she turned and walked toward the church, her back straight, her steps measured. Austin watched her go, feeling something crack inside the fortress he'd built around his heart. Austin sat on his horse at the edge of town, supplies packed, mountains waiting. He should ride out now, before the wedding ended, before he had to see Beatrice as another man's wife. Yet he couldn't make himself give the command to move. The memory of her had come flooding back, along with all he'd forced himself to forget. Her father's kindness to the Prescott family. The summer days spent exploring the forest together. The way she'd kissed him back, inexperienced but eager, when he'd finally gathered the courage. The promise he'd made, believing in a future that had been violently ripped away mere weeks later. He was still sitting there, lost in thought, when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, he saw Beatrice riding toward him on a dappled mare, still in her riding clothes. Austin's heart thundered in his chest. "The wedding. I couldn't do it," she said simply, pulling her horse alongside his. "I told myself I was being practical, that security was enough. But seeing you again." She trailed off, then straightened. "I'm not asking for anything. I just couldn't marry him when my heart remembered what it wanted." Austin stared at her. This woman who'd grown from the girl he'd known, who'd carried the memory of him when he'd tried so hard to forget everything about his past. "The mountains are no place for a woman," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I'm not asking to go to the mountains," she replied firmly. "But you can't spend your whole life running from loss, Austin. Sooner or later, you have to decide if loneliness is really safer than risking your heart again." Her words hit him like a physical blow because they laid bare the truth he'd been avoiding for years. He wasn't staying in the mountains because he loved the solitude. He was hiding there because he was terrified of caring for someone who could be taken away. Before Austin could respond, shouts erupted from the direction of the church. A group of men appeared, led by a red-faced man in a fine suit whom Austin assumed must be the abandoned groom. "There she is," one of the men called. "Miss Zimmerman, you come back here right now." Beatrice, her would-be husband, called, his voice more controlled but tight with anger. "This is unbecoming behavior. Return to the church immediately." Beatrice's face paled, but she lifted her chin. "I can't marry you, Edward. I'm sorry. This is about him, isn't it?" Edward pointed accusingly at Austin. "This mountain savage. You'd throw away everything I offered for this." Austin tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. "Mr. Holden," Beatrice said firmly, "I wish you no ill, but I won't be spoken to this way. I've returned your ring and explained my reasons. Please respect my decision." The banker's face darkened. "You've humiliated me in front of the entire town. There will be consequences for this." The threat in his voice made Austin move his horse forward, positioning himself between Beatrice and the angry men. "The lady's made her choice," he said, his voice low. "I suggest you accept it and move on." Holden's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, trapper. I own half the businesses in this territory. One word from me, and you'll find no one willing to buy your furs or sell you supplies." Austin felt a familiar coldness settle over him. The same detachment he felt when facing down a grizzly or a mountain lion. "Threats don't work well on a man who needs nothing from civilization, Mr. Holden." For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other. Then, abruptly, Holden turned to his companions. "Let's go. She's made her choice. Let her live with it." He looked at Beatrice one last time. "When winter comes, remember what you've turned down today." As the men departed, Austin turned to Beatrice. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly on the reins. "I will be." "Where will you go?" he asked. "My cousin's family is in Helena. They'll take me in until I find work." Austin looked toward the mountains, then back at Beatrice. The walls he'd built over years of solitude were crumbling, revealing the man he'd been before grief and fear had driven him into isolation. That man had known how to love, had made promises, had believed in a future. "Beatrice," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I can't ask you to go into the mountains with me. But maybe it's time I came down from them." Her eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I remembered you the moment I saw you. I just didn't want to admit it, because remembering you meant remembering everything else, the promises, the hope, all the things I lost." "Austin, let me finish," he said gently. "The wilderness taught me how to survive, but not how to live. Seeing you again, it's like waking up from a long, cold sleep." Beatrice's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I didn't come looking for you expecting anything." "I know," Austin replied. "That's what makes you still the bravest person I've ever known. You've always had the courage to follow your heart." He took a deep breath. "There's a homestead claim available near Deer Creek. Good water, decent soil. Not far from town, but far enough for privacy." Hope bloomed in Beatrice's expression. "You've been considering it?" "Since yesterday," Austin admitted. "Seeing you again made me remember there might be things worth building, not just surviving for." "A homestead needs a woman's touch," Beatrice said cautiously. Austin smiled, a real smile that felt foreign on his face after so long. "It would need more than that. It would need patience. I've been alone a long time, B. I've forgotten how to be around people. We could remember together," she offered, her voice soft but certain. Austin reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "It won't be easy. I'm not the boy you knew. And I'm not the girl you left behind," she countered. "But perhaps that's better. We're stronger now. We've both survived our own wilderness." As their fingers intertwined, Austin felt something shift within him, the first fragile shoots of hope pushing through the frozen ground of his heart. The next 3 months passed in a whirlwind of activity. Austin filed the homestead claim, then set to work building a modest cabin on the property. Beatrice stayed with her cousins in Helena, making regular trips to the homestead to help with planning and preparation. Austin discovered that years in the mountains had given him skills that translated well to homesteading. He could read the land, anticipate weather, hunt efficiently, and build sturdy structures. What he lacked was practice in the social graces that Beatrice navigated effortlessly, negotiating with merchants, establishing connections with neighbors, smoothing over his blunt manner with her natural charm. They were careful with each other, rebuilding trust slowly. Austin shared stories of his years in the mountains, the beauty and terror of true wilderness. Beatrice told him of her life after his disappearance, her father's decline, her struggles to maintain their farm alone, her journey west with her cousins. On a crisp October afternoon, Austin stood back to survey the completed cabin. It wasn't large, but it was solid, with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that caught the morning light. He'd even added a small covered porch where they could sit in the evenings. "It's beautiful," Beatrice said, coming to stand beside him. "A real home." "It's missing something," Austin replied. Beatrice looked at him questioningly. Austin reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's. I've carried it all these years, not sure why. Now I know I was keeping it for you." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Austin, I'm not good with words," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I want you to know I'm not running anymore. I want to build something permanent, something that matters." He took her hand. "I love you, Beatrice Zimmerman. I think I've loved you since we were children, even when I was trying to forget you existed." Tears spilled down Beatrice's cheeks. "I never stopped loving you. Even when I convinced myself you weren't coming back, even when I agreed to marry Edward, there was always a part of my heart that belonged to you." Austin slipped the ring onto her finger. "Marry me. Not because it's practical, not because it's safe, but because we choose each other, knowing exactly how much we have to lose." "Yes," she whispered, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. 1,000 times yes. Whispering Pines, Montana Territory, 1869. The small church was decorated simply with pine boughs and late autumn wildflowers. Austin stood at the altar, wearing a new suit that still felt stiff and unfamiliar. Jonas Weber stood beside him as best man, grinning broadly. "Never thought I'd see the mountain ghost getting hitched," Jonas whispered. Austin smiled. "Neither did I." The church door opened, and Beatrice appeared on the arm of her cousin. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, a cream-colored gown that set off her golden hair and fair complexion. She'd woven blue forget-me-nots into her braided crown, and her green eyes shone with happiness as they fixed on Austin. As she walked toward him, Austin felt a sense of wonder. This woman had remembered him when he'd tried to forget himself. She'd held on to hope when he'd abandoned it. And somehow, against all odds, she'd found him again. When she reached him, Austin took her hands in his. They were soft compared to his calloused ones, but he knew they held their own kind of strength. The ceremony proceeded traditionally until the moment the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. As Austin leaned down to kiss his bride, Beatrice whispered against his lips, "You don't remember me, do you? I was the girl you left behind, Mountain Man." Austin smiled, recognizing the echo of their reunion. "I remember everything now," he replied softly, "and I'm never leaving you behind again." Spring, 1870. Austin stood on the porch of their homestead, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. Behind him, through the open door, he could hear Beatrice humming as she prepared dinner. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, mingling with the scent of the vegetable garden she'd planted and the wildflowers growing along the path to their door. The past winter had been harsh, but they'd weathered it together. Their cabin had proven snug against the blizzards, and Austin's hunting skills had kept their larder full. Beatrice had transformed the interior into a true home, with curtains at the windows, rag rugs on the floors, and small touches that softened the rough-hewn walls. More than the physical comforts, though, Austin valued the emotional shelter they'd built together. He'd learned to share his fears and hopes, to accept comfort when memories of his parents' deaths haunted him, to offer the same when Beatrice grieved for her father. The vulnerability he'd once seen as weakness had become his greatest strength. "Supper's ready," Beatrice called, coming to the door. At 23, she glowed with happiness and health, her golden hair catching the last rays of sunlight. Austin turned and smiled at his wife. "I was just thinking about how right you were." "About what?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "About not spending your whole life running from loss." He put his arm around her shoulders. "I thought staying alone in the mountains was protecting me, but it was just keeping me from living." Beatrice leaned into him. "And now I understand that building something worth losing is exactly what makes life worth living." He placed his hand gently on her stomach, where the first signs of their child had begun to show. Family, home, love, they're all fragile. But they're everything. Beatrice covered his hand with hers. Our child will grow up knowing both the mountains and the valley. They'll learn to fish in the creek and trade in town. They'll know your strength and my patience. And they'll never doubt they're loved, Austin added. No matter what happens. As they stood together watching the day end and night begin, Austin felt a sense of peace he'd never known in his years of solitude. The mountains still called to him sometimes, with their promise of simplicity and silence. But the call of his heart was louder, and it was here, in the home he and Beatrice had built, in the future they were creating together. The mountain man had finally found his true wilderness, the courage to love completely, knowing the risk, accepting the vulnerability, and choosing it anyway.